I decided to start Helbrecht's paint job by giving him a Zenithal highlight prime. For those who've never heard of a Zenithal highlight, it's basically priming with a dark color and then using a lighter color from above. This gives the appearance of being under a harsh light. There are many tutorials that can teach you the fundamentals of Zenithal highlights if you'd like to know more, and I'd personally recommend Scott the Miniature Maniacs video on the topic, link in the description. This is to say that this highlight will be the basis for my paint job, and I'm very happy with how it turned out. I begin with Space Wolf's gray contrast paint on all the rocks, letting the Zenithal highlights shine through. Next is to start in on the Loyalist on the base. What chapter could he be from? We may never know. Now back to the model we're all here for. I begin with a thin layer of Caliban green on the armor. I started with Caliban green because I think that the Death Guard green is too light of a base color, and I prefer to work up from dark colors than to start with a light color and work my way down. Anyway, I decide that Caliban green is too thick and water it down into an impromptu dark green wash. It does the job and sinks into all the recesses. While waiting for the armor to dry, I began in on the cloak and the billowing smoke from the incense censers. The cloak I painted Magos purple, and the smoke I painted voluptuous pink. And then again I went back with Magos purple to get into the nooks and crannies of the cloak under the armor. It's at this point I come in with Wildwood contrast paint and begin in on the scythe. The reason I'm using a lot of contrast paints is because this is my first time trying a Zenithal highlight, and I want it to be the star of the show. If I use regular paints like the Caliban green I started with, I'm just going to obscure the highlights. This next part is probably one you should get used to. I break out the gold and begin chipping away at all the gold bits the model has. You see, gold is one of my favorite colors, so if I can make something gold, I will. If I can convince myself something could be gold, I'll make it gold. If I'm not sure about a metal, I'll paint it gold. I can always change it later, but at the same time, I may like it, and who knows. Anyway, I paint gold onto everything that should be gold and a few parts that probably shouldn't, but now it's time for Screaming Skull. I pick out any parts that should be bone, like the skulls and the smaller skulls. I also pick out the severed heads. These heads won't stay bone colored, but it's a great starting point for what I want to accomplish. I also pick out the horn on his shoulder and the purity seals on his leg. Now I'm here with Leadbelcher to pick out all the metal bits and dial back a little bit of the gold, as I decided it is a little much. At this point, I begin to paint mottled purple and green spots onto the severed head. This will make it appear like they have bruises and rotted skin once I apply a thin layer of Rickland flesh shade. I break out the Wildwood again to begin staining some of the gold bits. Although the highlights of the armor are gold, the Death Guard do not worry about the metal's upkeep. The gold that once so nobly adorned the armor has become tarnished and defiled by the taint of chaos. After the grimification, I began dry brushing metal back onto the tarnished parts where movement would have buffeted the metals clean, not on purpose, but as the inevitable fact of weathering and moving objects. At this point, it's finally time to break into that axe head. I begin with Helbrecht to give it a nice, sharp metallic color. Now it's time to look at the newest addition to my arsenal. I've been waiting on these technical paints for months, and they arrived just as I was in the middle of moving, so I haven't really had the chance to try them yet. So the three technical paints are a rust paint, a verdigris paint, and a moss paint, and I'm excited to try all of them out. For now, the rust technical is the one I want, so I clean it up and get to work. I used a little more of the rust technical than I thought I would need, but it turns out my estimations were fairly conservative and I ended up using less than I should have, and not quite getting the depth of color that I was looking for. I still think it looks pretty good and decided to move forward. This is my first time using the technical paint, and I can always improve in the future. After the rust had dried, I came back with Helbrecht to pick out the sharpest edges to give it that weathering effect. Then it's a dry brushing of Emperor's Children for the smoke, and a dry brushing of Zenithal bark for the wood. Followed up with a little more Emperor's Children for the cloak to make it stand out at the creases. I then bring in the Helbrecht to pick out the fly ornament on his right arm. I quickly decide I don't quite like the Helbrecht. Guess what color I go with instead of Helbrecht. After I pick out the fly ornament's body, I freehand its head. I then use Emperor's Children to pick out the torn flesh on the Space Marine on the base. Then use a little dibble of Screaming Skull to pick out the broken bone in his arm. Unfortunately, I'm about to cover this whole part in blood for the Blood God, so it really doesn't matter how I painted it, but I'll know, and now you will too. After I finish with the Space Marine, I begin to paint all the recesses of the river in Caliban green to simulate deep water. My plan is to do a toxic green resin pour. Unfortunately, I don't get to the resin pour due to a multitude of factors, including a lack of experience with resin and a crippling fear of failure. I did have time for a little test, but for now it's time to glue Helbrecht to his base, and with that he's just about done. He's done adjacent. I could not be happier with how he looks, and I'm gonna have fun seeing him on the tabletop after I stat him up. But I also want to hear what you guys think. Give me your thoughts about my model and the paint job in the comments. Now the painting's over and I have to clean up my workspace. That was easy. Now it's time for the big box. I've had this hobby resin kit for about a year now, and I'm just getting around to using it. I take a look at what's inside and begin to gently remove the contents. The main things I know I'm going to use are the resin, the hardener, the green coloring, a cup, and a stir stick, so I get to work and gather my tools. I also grab a gene stealer bit from the shelf I remembered. If I use a pre-painted arm, it saves me a lot of time. I mix the epoxy and the hardener, and then I add the coloring to the mix. Once a uniform color, I pour the mixture into the base and wait for the result. I think it turned out pretty good, and I like the hand sinking into the mire, but the slime's a little too dark green, and perhaps I should try again with Nurgle's rod added to the mix. Anyway, that's a question for another time. So yeah, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week I'm going to be painting up my roommate's Helbrecht that he converted a while back. If you're a fan of Blood Angels, I'd recommend stopping in for that one. Like I said, link to Miniacs video on Zenithal highlights in the description. If you like the video, go ahead and leave a comment if you have something to say. If you dislike the video, let me know what I can do better. If you'd like to support the channel, consider subscribing. It really helps out. And if you're feeling very generous, I even have my Patreon down in the description. Anyone who subscribes to the Patreon will have their name read out loud at the end of the next video. And that'll just about do it. I hope you've had a good week, and I hope you have a good week still. I'll see you next time, and stay safe.